Hey there, if you're watching this video, chances are you're either thinking about taking the SnowPro Core exam or you've already booked it and that little voice in your head keeps going, am I actually ready for this? If that sounds like you, you're in the right place. Today, I'm going to walk you through the entire SnowPro Core COF-C03 exam. Not just what's on it, but how it actually feels, how to think about the content, and how to prepare in a way that actually works in the real world. Now, before we dive in, let's set expectations. What this exam really tests is whether you understand how Snowflake works, why it works that way, and whether you can make smart decisions using the platform. So let's break that down together. First, let's talk about what this certification even is. The SnowPro Core certification is designed for people who have roughly 6 months of hands-on experience with Snowflake. That's important. This is not a beginner certification, but it's also not an expert level one. Think of it as the point where Snowflake stops being that cool cloud data warehouse and starts becoming something you actually understand architecturally. When you pass this exam, you're basically saying, I know how Snowflake is built. I know how to use it safely and efficiently. And I know how to design solutions that won't blow up costs or performance. And yes, that absolutely has real-world value. Now, one thing I want to say up front, because this surprises a lot of people, the exam does not test basic SQL syntax. It does not teach cloud fundamentals from scratch. You're expected to already know things like what a table is, how select statements work, the general idea of cloud storage versus compute. If you're shaky there, that's okay. Just make sure you brush up before you dive deep into Snowflake-specific topics. Now let's talk about the exam structure, because knowing this alone can lower your stress level by about 30%. The SnowPro Core exam is divided into 5 domains, and each domain has a different weight. The largest domain on the exam, making up about 31%, is Snowflake AI Data Cloud Features and Architecture. Almost 1/3 of the entire exam is focused on architecture and core platform features. This alone should completely change how you prepare. This is not a domain you can skim. This is not a domain you can kind of understand. This is the backbone of the exam. Now, what does this domain really mean? It means Snowflake wants to know if you truly understand how the platform works under the hood. We're talking about the 3-layer architecture, object hierarchy, storage concepts, virtual warehouses, Snowflake-specific compute behavior, and increasingly AI and application features. A lot of people assume this domain is mostly theory, but that's not true. The questions here are very practical. They're just disguised as conceptual. For example, you won't just be asked, what are the 3 layers of Snowflake? Instead, you'll see questions like, why a certain query doesn't need warehouse compute? Why a DDL statement executes instantly? Why scaling a warehouse didn't improve parsing time? These questions are testing whether you understand what happens in the cloud services layer versus the compute layer. And if you don't understand that separation deeply, this domain will feel brutal. This is where internal behavior, metadata operations, result cache, and architectural trade-offs really start to matter. Next up is account management and data governance, which makes up about 20% of the exam. On paper, it looks straightforward: security, roles, governance, cost tracking. But in practice, this is where many people lose easy points. Why? Because Snowflake security is powerful, but it's also very specific. This domain tests whether you understand role-based access control, ownership versus privileges, how roles inherit permissions, how masking and row-level security actually behave, how governance features work together. You might be wondering why Snowflake emphasizes this so much. Because in the real world, bad governance causes far more problems than slow queries. Data leaks, compliance failures, runaway costs, broken access patterns. So Snowflake wants certified professionals who can design safe and scalable access models, not just write SQL. Another big chunk of this domain is monitoring and cost management. You'll see scenarios involving resource monitors, credit usage, account usage views, warehouse spend analysis. And yes, there are questions where you need to know that certain monitoring features do not consume credits at all. If you skim this domain, you'll feel confident right until exam. Now let's talk about domain 3, data loading, unloading, and connectivity, which carries around 18% weightage. This domain feels very hands-on, and in many ways, it is. This is where Snowflake tests whether you understand how data actually gets in and out of the platform. You'll see concepts like file formats, internal and external stages, copy into behavior, error handling, snowpipe streaming, streams and tasks, dynamic tables. Now here's the key thing to remember. The exam does not want you to memorize syntax. It wants you to understand behavior and use cases. For example, when should you use snowpipe instead of scheduled copy into? When does snowpipe streaming make sense? Why would you use dynamic tables instead of streams and tasks? What happens when errors occur during a load? The connectivity portion also matters. Drivers, connectors, storage integrations, APIs, Git integration, these topics show up as conceptual questions. Again, Snowflake is asking, do you know how this platform connects to the rest of the ecosystem? Moving on to Domain 4, Performance Optimization, Querying and Transformation, which accounts for about 21% of the exam. This is another big one. If Domain 1 is about architecture, Domain 4 is about making Snowflake work efficiently. This domain tests your ability to analyze query performance, interpret query profiles, identify bottlenecks like spilling or inefficient pruning, understand workload management, use optimization features appropriately. You'll see topics like query acceleration service, search optimization, clustering keys, materialized views, caching behavior. And this is where a lot of people get tripped up because Snowflake feels like it just works until it doesn't. The exam wants to know if you understand why caching helped one query but not another, why a materialized view improved performance, why clustering helped in one scenario and hurt in another. Transformation techniques also show up here. Aggregations, window functions, semi-structured data handling, nothing too exotic, but you need to understand how these features interact with performance. Finally, we have Domain 5, Data Collaboration, which makes up about 10% of the exam. This is the smallest domain by weight, but it's still important. Snowflake is extremely proud of its collaboration capabilities, and for good reason. This domain covers time travel, failsafe, cloning, secure data sharing, reader accounts, marketplace listings, native apps, clean rooms. Now, even though this domain is smaller, the questions here are usually very clean. They test whether you understand how Snowflake shares data without copying it and how security is preserved across accounts. If you've actually used sharing, this domain often feels like free points. If you haven't, it's worth spending some focused time here. Now, let's talk honestly about preparation strategy, because this is where most people either succeed or fail. Start with popular online courses on Udemy and others to build foundation. They were great for understanding terminology, basic concepts, platform navigation. But here's the truth. Those courses alone are not enough to clear the exam. To really get exam ready, you have to go straight to Snowflake's official documentation guided by the SnowPro Core Exam Study Guide. Spend around 2 months preparing seriously. Not just watching videos, but reading docs, testing behaviors, and writing notes. A lot of exam difficulty comes from edge cases. Operations that don't require warehouse compute, queries served entirely from metadata, DDL statements executing without spinning up warehouses, count, min, max behaviors, result cache scenarios. These topics don't feel important at first until you see them on the exam. If you don't understand that distinction, those questions feel confusing, even unfair. But once you do understand it, they actually make perfect sense. Another thing that makes a huge difference is to practice harder scenario-based questions, not just straightforward, what does this feature do questions, but layered scenarios where multiple answers seem correct. If you align your preparation with the domain weightage, spend the most time on architecture and performance, take governance seriously, understand data loading behavior, learn caching, metadata, and internal execution paths. Your confidence going into the exam will feel completely different. And trust me, that confidence matters just as much as knowledge. Now let's talk about each of the domain in a bit more detailed manner. Snowflake architecture. Snowflake has 3 core layers, and the exam expects you to understand each one clearly. First, the cloud services layer. This is the brain of Snowflake. This layer handles things like authentication and authorization, metadata management, query optimization, Transaction management. So when you submit a query, this layer is the one figuring out what needs to happen. Now here's the key thing to remember for the exam. This layer is shared across the account, and it does not scale like warehouses do. So if you're ever asked, does increasing warehouse size improve query parsing? The answer is no. That happens here, not in compute. Next, the compute layer. This is where your virtual warehouses live. And this is where Snowflake really shines. Each warehouse is fully isolated. That means one team running a heavy query doesn't slow down another team. BI dashboards don't fight with data loads, and scaling is incredibly flexible. You might be wondering why Snowflake cares so much about this separation, because it gives you control over cost, control over performance, control over concurrency. And the exam loves asking questions that test whether you understand which warehouse type to use for which workload. Ad hoc analytics, BI dashboards, high concurrency reporting, heavy data loads, these are not interchangeable. And yes, Gen 1 versus Gen 2 warehouses do matter conceptually, even if you don't need to memorize internal implementation details. Finally, the database storage layer. This is where your data lives, and this data is compressed, encrypted, organized into micropartitions. You don't manage files, you don't manage indexes, you don't vacuum partitions manually. Snowflake handles all of that for you. Which leads us nicely into micropartitions. This topic shows up everywhere on the exam. Snowflake automatically breaks data into micropartitions, and each one stores metadata like min and max values, number of distinct values, null counts. Why does that matter? Because this metadata allows Snowflake to prune data intelligently. So instead of scanning an entire table, Snowflake only scans the micropartitions that actually matter. Now, here's where people get tripped up. Clustering does not create indexes. It does not reorder rows in the way traditional databases do. Clustering simply helps Snowflake maintain micropartitions in a way that improves pruning. And the exam will absolutely test whether you understand when clustering helps, when it doesn't, and when it's actually a bad idea. High cardinality columns, usually not great. Columns frequently used in filters, much better. Now let's talk about table types, because this is another favorite exam topic. Permanent tables, these are the default. They have full time travel and fail-safe. Transient tables, similar to permanent tables but cheaper because they don't have fail-safe. Temporary tables, session-based, automatically dropped. External tables, metadata in Snowflake, data outside. Apache Iceberg tables, yes, these are on the exam. You don't need to know every detail, but you do need to understand why Snowflake supports them and how they differ from native tables. Dynamic tables, also important. These are not views. They are not materialized views. They are managed, incrementally refreshed tables. And if you mix those concepts up on the exam, you will lose points. Now let's switch gears a little and talk about interfaces and tools, because Snowflake isn't just SQL in a browser anymore. You've got Snowsite, Snowflake CLI, IDE integrations like VS Code. The exam doesn't test you on keyboard shortcuts or UI layout. Instead, it tests whether you understand when and why you'd use each one. Snowsite for monitoring, visualization, quick exploration, CLI for automation and scripting, IDE integrations for developer workflows. That's it. Keep it simple. Next up, AI, ML, and application development features. Now, this is where the exam has evolved recently. You'll see questions about Snowpark, Snowflake notebooks, Streamlit in Snowflake, Snowflake Cortex, Snowflake ML. And you might be wondering, how deep do I need to go here? The answer is conceptually deep, technically light. You need to know what Snowpark is for, why you'd use it instead of UDFs, what Cortex does at a high level. For example, Snowpark lets you run Python, Java, or Scala inside Snowflake, using the same compute and security model. That means no data movement, no external processing, better performance. Cortex brings AI directly into SQL, things like sentiment analysis, search, and LLM-powered functions. You don't need to memorize function names. You need to understand use cases. All right, let's move into domain 2, account management and data governance. This is where a lot of people underestimate the exam. Security and governance account for 20% of the questions, and these questions are rarely obvious. Snowflake uses role-based access control, or RBAC. That means privileges are granted to roles. Roles are assigned to users. Roles can inherit from other roles. And yes, you absolutely need to understand system-defined roles, custom roles, database roles, secondary roles. One of the most common traps on the exam is confusing ownership with privileges. Ownership is powerful. It allows the owner to grant access to others. That's discretionary access control, or DAC. And the exam loves asking which model allows object owners to grant access. That's DAC, not RBAC. Data governance is another huge piece. You'll see topics like row-level security, column-level masking, object tagging, privacy policies, trust center. Now, this one's really interesting. Data classification automatically detects sensitive data. Object tagging labels objects. Masking hides data. Row access policies filter rows. Each one does something different. And the exam will give you scenarios and ask, which feature directly solves this? You need to read carefully. Monitoring and cost management also matter a lot. Resource monitors do not consume credits, do not slow down warehouses, simply track usage and enforce limits. And yes, the exam will test that exact point. You should also know how to use the account usage schema to analyze query history, credit usage, warehouse consumption. Now let's talk about domain 3, data loading, unloading, and connectivity. This is where Snowflake starts to feel very practical. File formats, stages, copy into, error handling, internal stages versus external stages, server-side encryption, directory tables. You don't need to memorize syntax, but you do need to understand behavior. For example, when to use Snowpipe, when to use Snowpipe streaming, when tasks and streams make sense, when dynamic tables are a better option, and connectivity, drivers, connectors, storage integrations, API integrations, Git integration. Again, focus on why, not how. Domain 4 is all about performance optimization. This is where Snowflake stops being magic and starts being engineering. Query profile, bytes spilled, inefficient pruning, exploding joins, queuing. If you've ever opened a query profile and felt overwhelmed, you're not alone. But the exam only tests whether you know what these indicators mean and what actions they suggest. Caching is another big one. Query result cache, metadata cache, warehouse cache. Know the difference. Know when each one applies. Know what invalidates them. Finally, domain 5, data collaboration. This is one of Snowflake's most powerful features. Time travel, fail-safe, cloning, secure data sharing, reader accounts, marketplace listings, native apps, clean rooms. And here's the key takeaway. Snowflake sharing does not copy data. It shares metadata and access. That's why it's secure. That's why it's fast. That's why it's cheap. Now let's talk about exam strategy, because knowing the content is only half the battle. First, schedule your exam. Having a date changes everything. Second, study by domain weight. Spend more time where the points are. Third, use hands-on labs. Reading alone will not cut it. Fourth, take practice exams, not to memorize answers, but to learn how Snowflake asks questions. And finally, don't overthink it. If you've worked with Snowflake, if you understand why things work the way they do, if you've built even a few real solutions, you are more ready than you think. So what does this really mean for you? And if you approach it with curiosity instead of anxiety, you'll not only pass the exam, you'll become a much stronger Snowflake professional. All right, that's it for this one, and I'll see you in the next video.